What if I told you that a dog was the only witness to a brutal murder? Max saw everything, and now he might be the key to solving a perfect crime. In this video, you'll discover how a loyal guard dog exposed a killer and uncovered a secret no one saw coming. If you love mystery stories and shocking twists, make sure to subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into this incredible story. The air was thick with fog, swirling over the dark waters of the Hudson River. Streetlights flickered dimly, casting weak glows on the worn pavement of the old stone bridge. It was well past midnight, and the city seemed to hold its breath, wrapped in a suffocating silence that only the occasional rustling of leaves dared to break. Brian Lancaster tightened the grip on his coat as he stepped onto the bridge. His expensive leather shoes clicked against the damp surface, the sound swallowed by the mist. He glanced over his shoulder. No one. Perfect. Ahead, leaning against the stone railing, stood Richard Holloway, the frail but sharp-minded businessman who had made a fortune in real estate. His silver hair was neatly combed back, but his posture betrayed fatigue. He turned as he heard Brian's approaching footsteps, his face lighting up with an unsuspecting smile. "Brian," Richard greeted, his voice hoarse from age and the night's cold. "I wasn't expecting you here so late." Brian returned the smile, but it was a mask, a well-rehearsed performance. "I wanted to talk to you about something important," he said, stepping closer, his hands buried in the pockets of his wool coat. "Something urgent," Richard exhaled, watching his breath form a faint cloud in the air. "This doesn't sound good." "It's about the company," Brian continued, his voice smooth but firm. "You've built something incredible, Richard, but you're not getting any younger. And lately, you've been making some questionable decisions." Richard's smile faded, replaced by a guarded expression. "Is that so?" Brian nodded. "Investors are nervous. They don't believe you have the strength to keep running things. I hate to say it, but maybe it's time to step down." Richard narrowed his eyes. "And let me guess, you think you should be the one to take over?" Brian let out a soft chuckle. "I'm the logical choice." Richard shook his head. "I always knew you were ambitious, Brian, but I never thought you'd stoop this low." He turned back to the railing, gazing at the dark waters below. "If you think I'm just going to hand over everything I worked for, you're mistaken." Brian's jaw tightened. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from cold, calculated determination. He took a step closer. "I was hoping you'd see reason," he said, his voice now a whisper laced with menace. Richard's grip on the stone railing tightened. "I see it clearly now," he said. "I should have never trusted you." Brian's hand moved swiftly, pressing against Richard's back. It was quick, almost effortless. Richard barely had time to gasp before he was lifted off his feet. His hands scrambled against the stone, trying to find something, anything, to hold on to. "Brian, no." But the plea was swallowed by the wind. Brian shoved him harder, and Richard's body toppled over the edge. There was no scream, just a dull splash, the river swallowing him whole. The current moved swiftly, the water rippling in the dim light before settling back into eerie stillness. Brian stood motionless, listening. No shouts, no footsteps, no witnesses. He exhaled slowly, forcing his pulse to steady. It was done. He turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the fog like a ghost. But he wasn't alone. From the shadows, a pair of amber eyes watched. Max, Richard Holloway's faithful German shepherd, crouched low behind the bushes near the bridge's entrance. His ears were pinned back, his body tense. He had seen everything. The dog's deep brown eyes locked onto Brian as he walked away. Max's mind didn't process betrayal the way humans did, but he understood something was terribly wrong. His master had vanished, and the man who had always been around him, Brian, was leaving with a scent of deceit. With one last glance at the bridge, Max turned and bolted into the darkness, running toward the only place he knew could help. Tomorrow, Brian would wake up believing he had committed the perfect crime. He had no idea a four-legged witness was about to destroy everything. The mansion stood at the edge of a sprawling estate, its towering columns casting long shadows under the moonlight. The Holloway residence had always been a place of grandeur, filled with the echoes of power and wealth. But tonight, it was eerily quiet. Max sprinted through the iron gates, his paws barely making a sound against the damp pavement. His breath came in short, desperate pants, his heart hammering against his ribs. His master was gone. He had seen it happen with his own eyes, yet he couldn't understand why. He burst into the main courtyard, his claws scraping against the cobblestones as he skidded to a stop. The lights inside the mansion were dim, but through the massive glass doors, he could see movement. Inside, Margaret Holloway, Richard's longtime housekeeper, was clearing away a set of unused dinnerware, muttering about how the old man had barely touched his food before heading out. Max let out a deep, mournful howl. Margaret startled, nearly dropping a crystal glass. She turned sharply, her brows furrowing as she hurried to the door. "Max," she called, unlocking the latch. The moment she pulled the door open, the dog pushed past her, pacing frantically. His ears twitched, his nose flaring as he ran toward the office, the room where Richard spent most of his time. "Max, what's gotten into you?" Margaret asked, following him, her voice filled with concern. But Max wouldn't settle. He barked, a sharp, demanding sound that echoed through the empty halls. At that moment, footsteps descended the grand staircase. Catherine Monroe, a seasoned detective with the NYPD, had arrived at the mansion earlier that evening after receiving a report about Richard's disappearance. A woman in her early 40s, with piercing green eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, Catherine had seen her fair share of missing persons cases. She had come here expecting an old man who had simply wandered off. Now, as she stepped into the hallway and saw Max's frantic behavior, something in her gut told her this wasn't just a routine case. "What's wrong with him?" Catherine asked, watching as the dog clawed at the office door. Margaret shook her head. "I don't know. He's never acted like this before." Catherine moved closer, crouching slightly to get a better look at the dog. Max wasn't just barking. He was leading. He scratched at the wooden door, turned to look at her, then did it again. "What's in there?" Catherine asked. Margaret hesitated. "Just Mr. Holloway's office. His private files, business documents, that sort of thing." Catherine exchanged a glance with Margaret before reaching for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a large, elegant study filled with dark mahogany shelves and a massive oak desk. The scent of aged paper and faint cigar smoke lingered in the air. Max darted inside, his nose working furiously. Then he stopped. Catherine followed his gaze to a corner near the fireplace, where an old, weathered walking cane lay on the floor. The polished wood was smeared with dirt, as if it had been dropped hastily. Margaret gasped. "That's Mr. Holloway's cane. He never goes anywhere without it." Catherine's expression darkened. A man of Richard Holloway's age wouldn't have simply abandoned his cane unless something had gone terribly wrong. She bent down, inspecting the object closely. Where exactly was Mr. Holloway going tonight? Margaret wrung her hands. "He mentioned meeting someone. He didn't say who, just that it was important." Catherine straightened, her detective instincts kicking in. "Did he seem worried? Anxious?" Margaret nodded. "He was different tonight. Quiet. Like he knew something was about to happen." Catherine looked down at Max, who was now sitting by the cane, his ears pinned back. She reached out, gently running a hand over his head. "You saw something, didn't you, boy?" she murmured. Max whined softly in response. Catherine exhaled sharply. This was no ordinary disappearance. Turning back to Margaret, she asked, "Does Mr. Holloway have security cameras on the property?" Margaret's face fell. "Not at the bridge where he was meeting this person. He always said it was a private place where he could think." Catherine clenched her jaw. That made things more complicated. No cameras, no direct witnesses, except for the dog in front of her. She looked at Max again, watching as he sniffed the cane before letting out another quiet whimper. "You're trying to tell me something," she muttered. Max suddenly turned, sprinting toward the front door. Margaret took a step forward. "Where's he going?" Catherine grabbed her coat. "I think he wants to show us." With that, she followed Max into the cold night, a growing suspicion burning in her mind. Something had happened to Richard Holloway, and Max was about to lead her straight to the truth. The morning sun filtered through the glass windows of Holloway Enterprises, casting long beams of light across the marble lobby. The company headquarters, a towering building in Manhattan's financial district, was already buzzing with employees in tailored suits and polished shoes, sipping coffee as they exchanged pleasantries. Brian Lancaster stepped through the revolving doors, his posture composed, his face carefully molded into an expression of quiet concern. He was dressed impeccably, as always, his navy blue suit pressed to perfection, his tie knotted just right. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind, knowing exactly how to play his part. The whispers had already begun. "Have you heard? Mr. Holloway never came home last night. I saw Detective Monroe at his house this morning. Something's not right." Brian approached the front desk, where the company's assistant manager, Peter Evans, stood nervously fidgeting with his tie. Peter looked up the moment he saw Brian, relief washing over his face. "Brian," Peter said, exhaling sharply. "Thank God you're here. Have you heard?" Brian furrowed his brows, the perfect image of a concerned employee. "What's going on?" "It's Mr. Holloway," Peter said, lowering his voice. "He didn't come home last night. No one's heard from him." Brian's expression shifted to one of calculated worry. "That doesn't sound like him." Peter shook his head. "Not at all. He was supposed to meet with some potential investors today. He never misses a meeting." Brian let out a slow breath, pretending to process the information. "Have the police been called?" Peter nodded. "Yeah, a detective was at his house early this morning. She took some statements. But honestly, I have a bad feeling about this." Brian placed a firm hand on Peter's shoulder, offering a reassuring squeeze. "Let's not panic just yet. Maybe he just needed some time alone." Peter exhaled and nodded. "I hope you're right." Brian gave a small, measured smile before turning toward the elevators. Inside, as the doors slid shut, his fingers curled into fists. He needed to control the narrative. By mid-morning, Brian had already made his rounds, stopping by the executive offices, speaking to a few board members, planting the right amount of doubt. "I just don't know what to think," he told one of them, shaking his head as he sipped his coffee. Richard had been under a lot of stress lately. He wasn't himself. A few subtle words here, a carefully placed sigh there. He knew how to manipulate people. It was an art. By noon, his phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket and glanced at the screen. Unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "This is Brian." A voice distorted by a poor connection whispered, "I know what you did." Brian's blood ran cold. "What?" he said, his voice steady, but his grip on the phone tightening. "You heard me," the voice said. "Richard Holloway didn't just vanish, did he?" The line went dead. Brian slowly lowered the phone, his pulse hammering in his ears. This wasn't supposed to happen. By early evening, Brian made his way to the Holloway mansion. He had to keep up appearances, and visiting the house to check on things was the perfect excuse. The police were still coming and going, and the sight of Detective Catherine Monroe's car parked out front made his stomach twist. He took a breath, straightened his tie, and walked inside. Margaret, the longtime housekeeper, met him at the door. Her eyes were red, her face tired. "Brian," she said, her voice weak. "This is terrible." "I know," he said, stepping inside, his voice full of false sympathy. "Any news?" Margaret shook her head. "Nothing yet. But," she hesitated, "Max has been acting strange." Brian's jaw clenched. "Strange how?" Margaret motioned toward the office. "He won't leave Mr. Holloway's study. And he doesn't like you being here." As if on cue, a deep growl echoed from down the hallway. Brian turned his head slowly. There, standing in the dim light of the office doorway, was Max. His golden brown eyes locked onto Brian with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. His lips curled just slightly, revealing sharp white teeth. Brian forced a chuckle. "Come on, Max," he said, stepping forward. "You know me." Max didn't move. His tail was stiff, his ears pinned back. Brian could feel the weight of Margaret's gaze. He couldn't afford to let any fear show. He took another step forward. Max let out a deep, rumbling growl, louder this time. Brian froze. Margaret frowned. I've never seen him act this way with someone he knows, she murmured. Brian cleared his throat. Dogs can sense stress. Maybe he's just picking up on everyone's anxiety. Margaret didn't look convinced, but before she could say anything, Catherine Monroe appeared from the hallway. Mr. Lancaster, she said, her eyes sharp. Didn't expect to see you here. Brian turned, his expression carefully neutral. Detective Monroe, I wanted to check in. She studied him for a long moment before stepping closer. That's considerate of you, Max growled again. This time so low it was nearly a whisper in the back of his throat. Catherine glanced at the dog, then back at Brian. He doesn't seem to like you very much, she said. Brian forced a laugh. Dogs are unpredictable creatures. Catherine's lips twitched in a smirk. Actually, they're not. A pause. Brian knew when he was being sized up. Finally, Catherine stepped back, crossing her arms. Tell me something, Mr. Lancaster. When was the last time you saw Richard Holloway? Brian's heart pounded, but his mask never slipped. He smiled. Yesterday afternoon. Why? Catherine tilted her head slightly. Just curious. She let the silence hang between them before turning away. I'll be in touch. Brian exhaled slowly, feeling Max's gaze burning into his back. He had fooled many people in his life, but for the first time, he had the sinking feeling he wouldn't be able to fool them all. Detective Catherine Monroe sat at her cluttered desk inside the NYPD's Manhattan precinct, rubbing her temples as she reviewed the case file on Richard Holloway's disappearance. The room was dimly lit, the soft hum of late-night police activity filling the air. A half-empty cup of coffee sat beside her, untouched and cold. She had handled countless missing persons cases, but something about this one gnawed at her. Richard Holloway was not the type to simply vanish. A man of his stature, with his level of influence, always left a trail. And yet, here they were. No phone calls, no credit card transactions, nothing. Except for Max, Catherine had seen police dogs detect drugs, explosives, even corpses buried deep underground. But what Max had done tonight at the Holloway mansion, that wasn't just instinct. That was something else. He had looked at Brian Lancaster like he saw a ghost. And Catherine trusted a dog's instincts far more than a well-dressed businessman's words. By morning, she was back at the Holloway estate, standing near the grand study where Max had growled at Brian the night before. The sunlight streamed through the high-arched windows, illuminating the deep mahogany furniture and rows of books that lined the walls. Margaret, the housekeeper, hovered nearby, nervously wringing her hands. I keep thinking about what Max did, she said softly. Mr. Holloway adored that dog, and now he's acting like... She trailed off, shaking her head. It just doesn't make sense. Catherine glanced at Max, who sat by the fireplace, ears perked as he watched them. He's trying to tell us something, Catherine murmured, kneeling down to scratch behind his ears. Dogs don't hold grudges. If he doesn't trust someone, it's for a reason. Margaret hesitated before speaking again. Detective, do you think Brian had something to do with Mr. Holloway's disappearance? Catherine didn't answer right away. She had no hard evidence, just a gut feeling and a dog who wouldn't stop growling. That wouldn't be enough in court. I think Brian Lancaster is hiding something, she said finally. Margaret nodded, then motioned toward the large oak desk. Mr. Holloway kept a lot of personal documents here. If there's anything that might tell us who he was meeting that night, it's probably in there. Catherine moved to the desk, running her fingers over its smooth surface before testing the drawers. Locked. Margaret retrieved a small key from a cabinet nearby. He always kept a spare. With a click, the drawer opened. Inside were neatly stacked folders, financial reports, legal documents, nothing immediately suspicious. But as Catherine flipped through them, one envelope caught her attention. It was labeled private, for my attorney. She tore it open and unfolded the letter inside. Margaret watched as Catherine's expression darkened. What is it? Catherine read aloud. If anything happens to me, look at my financial records for discrepancies. Someone close to me is not who they claim to be. Margaret gasped. You think he knew someone was after him? Catherine exhaled slowly. Looks that way. Just then, her phone buzzed. She checked the caller ID. Officer Davis, Crime Scene Unit. Monroe, she answered. "We found something," Davis said, "near the river. You're going to want to see this." By the time Catherine arrived at the scene, the area had been cordoned off with yellow tape. A group of officers stood near the riverbank, where the fog still clung to the water. Davis, a tall man with graying hair and sharp eyes, waved her over. "A jogger found it early this morning." Catherine stepped closer and saw it. A long, expensive overcoat, drenched and half buried in the mud. Richard Holloway's coat. Her pulse quickened. "Any sign of a body?" she asked. Davis shook his head. "Not yet. But this? This was no accident." Catherine crouched down, inspecting the coat. The fabric was torn near the collar, like someone had grabbed it, maybe tried to pull him back, or push him forward. She turned to Davis. "Run a full analysis. DNA, fibers, everything." He nodded, and as she stepped back, her mind was already racing ahead. The last person confirmed to have seen Richard Holloway? Brian Lancaster. She pulled out her phone and dialed his number. It rang. Once. Twice. Then went to voicemail. She clenched her jaw. He was avoiding her. That was fine. She would find him another way. Max had already sniffed out the truth. Now, it was time for her to prove it. The NYPD precinct was alive with movement. Phones ringing, officers exchanging updates, and the occasional clatter of a coffee cup being set down too hard. Detective Catherine Monroe moved through the chaos with purpose, gripping the evidence report she had just received. Richard Holloway's overcoat had been confirmed as his, and preliminary tests showed microscopic fibers under the collar, possibly from a struggle. But no body. That meant two possibilities. Either Richard Holloway was still alive, or his body had been carried away by the river's strong current. Neither answer gave Catherine the certainty she needed. And then there was Max. The German shepherd sat obediently beside her desk, his ears twitching at every movement. Since the night at the Holloway estate, he had been restless, and Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that the dog still had something to show her. She glanced down at him. "You saw everything, didn't you, boy?" Max let out a low whine, his amber eyes fixed on her. Catherine sighed, rubbing the bridge of her nose. She needed something concrete, something that would push this case forward. Then her phone rang. "Monroe," she answered, balancing it between her ear and shoulder. "It's Davis," came the voice from the crime scene unit. "We got a possible break." A local fisherman reported seeing a walking cane floating downstream early this morning. "We sent a dive team to check it out." Catherine sat up straighter. "And we found it. Holloway's cane." Her grip on the phone tightened. "Where?" "Near the old ferry dock, about 2 miles from the bridge." "I'm on my way," she said, grabbing her coat. She looked down at Max. "Come on, boy. Let's see what else you can find." The drive to the ferry dock was a short one, and when Catherine pulled up, the dive team was already packing up their gear. Officer Davis waved her over, holding a long, polished wooden cane inside an evidence bag. "This was stuck in some reeds by the riverbank," he explained. Catherine took the bag and examined the cane. The initials RH were engraved in gold near the handle. There was no doubt. It belonged to Richard Holloway. And then she saw it. Near the base of the cane, faint but unmistakable, was a dark smear. Blood. Davis caught her expression. "We'll need lab confirmation, but it looks like he was injured before he hit the water." Catherine exhaled sharply. That means there was a struggle. Someone fought him before he went over that bridge. She looked down at Max, who had been sniffing the damp ground near the dock. His body tensed suddenly, his ears pricking forward. Then, without warning, he took off. "Max," Catherine called, but the dog was already darting toward a nearby wooded area. Davis frowned. "What's he doing?" Catherine didn't hesitate. She ran after Max. The wooded area was thick with damp leaves and tangled underbrush. Max moved quickly, his nose to the ground, weaving between trees with single-minded focus. Catherine followed, her breath coming in quick bursts. Finally, Max stopped. Catherine caught up, her boots skidding slightly on the soft earth. Max was standing near the base of a large oak tree, his nose pressed against something half buried in the dirt. Catherine knelt down and brushed away the damp soil. Her stomach clenched. A leather wallet. She opened it, her pulse spiking as she read the name on the ID inside. Richard Holloway. She stared at the wallet for a long moment, then looked at Max. Good boy. Davis arrived seconds later. What is it? Catherine handed him the wallet. Someone tried to get rid of this. Davis examined it, his brow furrowed. If Holloway was robbed, why wasn't the wallet taken completely? Why leave it here? Because this wasn't about money, Catherine murmured. This was about silencing him. She straightened, her mind working rapidly. The cane, the blood, the abandoned wallet. It was all coming together. Someone wanted to make sure Richard Holloway never left that bridge alive. And she had a strong feeling she knew exactly who that someone was. That evening, back at the precinct, Catherine sat across from Brian Lancaster in an interrogation room. Brian looked as polished as ever, his suit crisp, his expression composed. He even had the nerve to smile as she took her seat. Detective Monroe, he greeted smoothly. To what do I owe the pleasure? Catherine placed the evidence bag containing the wallet onto the table. Brian's smile didn't falter, but something in his eyes flickered. We found this near the riverbank, Catherine said, folding her hands on the table, not far from where we also recovered Richard Holloway's cane. With blood on it, Brian leaned back in his chair. And, she said, tilting her head slightly, I find it interesting that the last confirmed person to have seen Mr. Holloway was you. Brian chuckled. Detective, I hope you're not suggesting that I had something to do with Richard's disappearance. Catherine didn't blink. Tell me, Mr. Lancaster, why do you think Max doesn't like you? For the first time, Brian's composure slipped. It was slight, just a twitch of his jaw, a brief hesitation. Catherine leaned forward. Dogs don't lie, Brian. They don't fake emotions. And right now, Max is telling me everything I need to know. Brian's jaw tightened. I think you're overestimating an animal's instincts. Catherine sat back, studying him. Maybe. Or maybe Max saw something that night. Something he can't say out loud, but he can sure as hell show us. Silence stretched between them. Then Brian exhaled, shaking his head. Detective, I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about. Catherine smirked. That's okay. I have a feeling Max will help me figure it out. She stood, grabbing the evidence back. Enjoy the rest of your night, Mr. Lancaster, she said before walking out. Behind her, Brian sat motionless, his fingers gripping the table just a little too tightly. He knew, and for the first time, he realized something chilling. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a witness. The city was restless that evening. Rain drizzled over Manhattan, painting the streets with streaks of gold and red from the traffic lights. Catherine Monroe sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel, her mind replaying every detail of the case. Brian Lancaster had been smooth, too smooth. She had seen hardened criminals break under pressure, but Brian? He had walked out of that interrogation room like he was untouchable. But he wasn't. She had Max. She had Holloway's cane. She had a blood-stained coat. And now, she had Emily Carter. Her phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number. Meet me in 15 minutes. 221, Lincoln Avenue. Come alone. Catherine exhaled sharply. Emily Carter had insisted on anonymity. She had something big, but she was scared. Catherine grabbed her coat. She wasn't about to let this lead slip away. 221, Lincoln Avenue was an old apartment building in Brooklyn, the kind where the elevator was permanently out of service and the hallways smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. Catherine climbed the narrow staircase to the third floor, her footsteps barely making a sound against the worn carpet. She found apartment 3B and knocked twice. A few seconds later, the door cracked open, revealing a pair of wary brown eyes. Emily Carter was young, probably in her mid-20s, with dark hair pulled into a messy bun and a hoodie zipped up to her chin. She looked over Catherine's shoulder, as if expecting someone to be watching. You're alone? Emily whispered. Catherine nodded. Like you asked. Emily hesitated, then opened the door wider. Come in. Catherine stepped inside. The apartment was small, sparsely furnished, but clean. A single lamp cast a dim glow over a cluttered desk where a laptop sat next to a pile of notebooks. Emily locked the door behind her, then turned to Catherine, her hands trembling. I need you to promise me something, she said. If I give you this, you have to protect me. He can't know I was there. Catherine's eyes sharpened. Who? Emily swallowed hard. Brian Lancaster. Catherine felt her pulse quicken. You saw something? Emily didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over to the desk, picked up a USB drive, and handed it to Catherine. I filmed it, she said quietly. Catherine's fingers tightened around the drive. Filmed what? Emily looked her dead in the eye. The night Richard Holloway was murdered, back at the precinct, Catherine plugged the USB drive into her laptop. Max sat beside her chair, his eyes fixed on the screen as if he understood the weight of the moment. The video was grainy, shot from a distance, but the audio was clear. The footage showed the bridge, the fog, and two figures standing near the railing. Catherine's breath caught as she recognized Richard Holloway, gripping his cane, facing a taller man. Brian Lancaster. She turned up the volume. You think you can just take everything from me? Richard's voice was firm, but there was an edge of fear in it. Richard, be reasonable, Brian said, his tone eerily calm. You're an old man. You don't have much time left. Why not step aside and let someone more capable take over? Richard shook his head. You'll never get your hands on my company, Brian. I see you now for what you really are. There was a scuffle. The camera shook slightly as Emily repositioned herself. Then, Richard gasped. His cane slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the pavement. Brian had his hands on Richard's shoulders. Brian, please. The shove was quick, brutal. Richard disappeared over the edge. A splash, then silence. The video ended. Catherine sat back in her chair, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Max let out a low growl. She reached down, running her fingers through his fur. You were right, boy, she murmured. She had him. Brian Lancaster was about to fall just like Richard Holloway. The rain was relentless, hammering against the glass windows of Holloway Enterprises. The city skyline, usually so vivid with life, was reduced to a blur of neon reflections on wet pavement. Brian Lancaster sat in his corner office, a glass of bourbon untouched on his desk. His jaw was tight, his fingers drumming against the polished wood. Something was wrong. He could feel it. It had started with the phone call, the anonymous threat, then the detective's visit, and now, silence. No updates, no reassurance, just an unbearable waiting game. His instincts, honed through years of calculated deception, were screaming at him. Someone had something on him, and then his phone buzzed. He grabbed it instantly, his pulse spiking. A single message glowed on the screen. Come to the bridge. Now. His grip tightened. He didn't recognize the number, but he knew exactly which bridge they meant. The same one where Richard Holloway had met his end. Brian exhaled sharply, grabbed his coat, and stepped out into the storm. 11:45 p.m. The bridge loomed ahead, its steel framework stretching into the darkness. The Hudson River roared beneath it, swollen from the rain, the current strong and unforgiving. Brian stepped forward, his shoes splashing against puddles, his coat pulled tightly around him. Then he saw her. Detective Catherine Monroe stood near the railing, her expression unreadable. Beside her, a shadow moved. Max. The dog was rigid, his amber eyes locked onto Brian with that same, unrelenting intensity. Brian forced a smirk. Detective Monroe, you really know how to set a scene. Catherine didn't move, didn't speak. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a phone, and hit play. Brian froze. Richard Holloway's voice filled the air, tinny but unmistakable. Brian, please. Then came the splash, the silence, and the final, damning sound of Brian's footsteps walking away. His heart slammed against his ribs. His mouth went dry. That, Catherine said, slipping the phone back into her pocket, is enough for a conviction. Brian clenched his jaw, his mind spinning. He had been careful. He had erased every trace. But someone had seen. His eyes flickered to Max. The dog had been there. The damn dog had watched everything. And someone else had filmed it. Emily Carter. Brian's breath quickened. He needed a way out. You can't prove it, he said, forcing his voice to stay even. A grainy video? A recording? That could be anything. Catherine's smirk was cold. That's cute, Brian. But you and I both know what's coming. Sirens. Distant, but closing in fast. Brian's pulse spiked. No, not like this. He turned on his heel, breaking into a sprint. But Max was faster. The German Shepherd lunged, his powerful body colliding with Brian's legs. Brian crashed onto the slick pavement, his hands scraping against the cold ground. Pain shot through his ribs as he gasped for breath. Then boots. He looked up, rain blurring his vision, just as Catherine loomed over him, gun drawn. This is where it ends, she said. Max stood beside her, ears back, eyes sharp. Brian panted, chest heaving, realization dawning. He had spent his whole life climbing to the top, and now a dog had brought him down. The sirens wailed closer, red and blue lights flashing against the rain-soaked pavement. Catherine Monroe stood over Brian Lancaster, her stance firm, her gun steady. Max remained beside her, his deep growl barely audible over the storm. Brian lay on the ground, his breath ragged, his designer suit soaked through. He knew the moment he saw those lights. This was it. The game was over. Brian Lancaster, Catherine said, her voice carrying over the storm. You're under arrest for the murder of Richard Holloway. Brian forced a bitter smile. You think you've won? He coughed, propping himself up on one elbow. You think some blurry video and a damn dog are enough? Catherine crouched slightly, her eyes narrowing. Oh, I know we've won. She pulled a second phone from her pocket. This one had been recording their conversation. Confessing at a crime scene, she said with a smirk. Not your smartest move. Brian's jaw clenched, his fingers curling into fists. The sound of tires screeching on wet pavement filled the air as two NYPD cruisers skidded to a stop. The moment the doors flew open, uniformed officers rushed forward, weapons drawn. Detective Monroe, Officer Davis called as he approached. You good? All good, Davis, she replied, keeping her gun trained on Brian. Cuff him. Brian let out a bitter chuckle. This is a mistake. No, Catherine said, holstering her weapon as Davis and another officer grabbed Brian's arms and yanked him to his feet. The mistake was thinking you could get away with it. Brian struggled briefly, but the officers were quick, snapping the cuffs onto his wrists. His smirk was gone, replaced by something colder, resentment, maybe even fear. This isn't over, he muttered, his voice low. You think you're a hero? You're just another cop playing detective. The real power in this city doesn't sit in police stations. It sits in boardrooms. Catherine tilted her head slightly. And yet, here you are, in handcuffs. Brian's jaw clenched as Davis pushed him toward the cruiser. The rain had slowed to a drizzle now, the storm finally passing. Max let out a quiet huff, as if satisfied. Catherine glanced down at him. Nice work, partner. Max wagged his tail once, then sat obediently at her feet, his job done. Later that night, NYPD, the precinct was quieter now, the chaos of the evening settling into a steady hum. Brian Lancaster had been booked, and the evidence against him was airtight. Catherine sat at her desk, rubbing her temples. It had been a long day, but the weight in her chest was lighter now. She glanced over at Max, who was curled up on a blanket near her desk, his breathing slow and steady. He had been through so much, seen things no dog should ever have to see. And yet, he had never given up. Looks like you've got a new home, huh? Max lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching. Catherine smirked. Hope you like solving cases, buddy. The dog gave a slow, approving wag of his tail. Outside, the city moved on. The rain had stopped. The lights of Manhattan flickered against the night sky. Justice had been served, and a new partnership had begun. The courtroom was packed. The press, the public, and the legal teams all filled the mahogany-lined chamber, their whispers blending into an impatient hum. At the front, Brian Lancaster sat beside his high-profile attorney, his face composed but his jaw tight. He was dressed in a tailored gray suit, but no amount of expensive fabric could hide the reality. He was a man cornered. Catherine Monroe sat near the front, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. She had seen men like Brian before, calculating, arrogant, convinced they were untouchable. But this time, the evidence was irrefutable. Max wasn't allowed inside the courtroom, but Catherine had made sure he got his moment of recognition. The German Shepherd had been the key witness, the reason Richard Holloway's murder had been solved. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already nicknamed him the dog who solved a murder. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and a no-nonsense expression, took her seat. She glanced over the papers in front of her, then at Brian. "Mr. Lancaster," she said, her voice firm, "you stand accused of murder in the first degree, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. How do you plead?" Brian's attorney stood. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Catherine rolled her eyes slightly. The trial was just a formality at this point. The prosecution presented its case with precision. The video footage from Emily Carter, the bloodstains on the cane, the wallet recovered near the riverbank, and finally, the damning recording of Brian himself, taken by Catherine on the bridge. When the prosecution rested, Brian's attorney attempted to poke holes in the case. He argued that the video wasn't clear enough to be conclusive, that Richard could have fallen by accident, that the cane's blood could have been from an old injury, but the jury wasn't buying it. After just 3 hours of deliberation, the verdict was read. Guilty. Brian's face remained expressionless, but Catherine caught the slight twitch in his clenched fist. The judge wasted no time. "Brian Lancaster, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." A collective sigh of relief passed through the courtroom. Justice had been served. 2 weeks later, Holloway Enterprises' Richard Holloway had left behind a vast fortune, one Brian had intended to steal. But Richard's will was clear. His estate, his wealth, and his company were to be transferred to the Holloway Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to helping underprivileged communities. Brian had planned to take everything. Instead, his greed had ensured that Holloway's legacy would live on. Catherine attended the foundation's official relaunch, standing near the back as Richard's former business partners and philanthropists gathered to celebrate his life's work. As speeches were made and applause filled the hall, she glanced down at Max, who sat obediently at her side. "You did this, you know," she murmured, scratching behind his ears. Max gave her a slow, contented wag of his tail. That night, Catherine's apartment. Catherine kicked off her boots, tossing her coat over a chair. Max padded in behind her, sniffing around his new home. She filled his bowl with fresh water, then leaned against the counter, watching him lap it up. "You've had a long couple of weeks, huh?" she mused. Max glanced up at her, his tail swishing against the floor. Catherine smirked. "You're gonna have to get used to a quieter life now." She walked over to the couch, sinking into the cushions. Max hesitated for only a second before jumping up beside her, resting his head on her lap. Catherine ran a hand through his fur, feeling a rare sense of peace settle over her. "You're a damn good detective, Max," she murmured. The dog let out a content sigh, closing his eyes. For the first time in weeks, the city outside felt calm. The case was closed. Justice had been served, and Catherine Monroe had just found herself the most loyal partner she'd ever had. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. If you watched until now, comment, "I watched until the end," and share your thoughts on this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video on the end screen. It's really exciting.